This morning I'm starting off with the plant growth and development section, and sadly for all of you, you'll have to stay awake long enough to hear me after morning tea as well talk about agronomy. So we'll see how we go. First thing I need to say is that all of this work's been done in collaboration with Stephanie Belfield, who was an agronomist with the department at Moree before she went private consulting. And then I say for fear of having to run these workshops, she had to abscond overseas. But really, Steph's working in Cambodia at the moment doing some consultancy work over there. So I do have to acknowledge her contributions. Okay, so what are we going to basically cover through this module? Well, this module is pretty much all about just walking through the growth stages for sunflowers. So how will you actually pick where the crop is at, make some decisions about what are the major environmental and I suppose management options that you can affect through sunflower growth. And finally, I suppose, try and put those decisions to use in terms of improving your yield. Okay, so all of this is in the manual. I've tried to be good and include a page number for those people who want to flick through the manual at the same time. Please do so. If not, it's there as a handy reference for later on. You'll find at the back of that module there's this kind of fairly simplified diagram about sunflower growth stages. We've been using this for a number of years, but in more recent times we've probably decided to adopt a more, I suppose, structured system, similar to what we do with cereals in terms of having the Zadox growth stages or looking at growth stage 31, etc. But for sunflowers we had to import some growth stages, and so we'll be using an American system which is fairly simple to step through as well. So we'll start off with the vegetative growth stages, and we'll move through the reproductive growth stages a bit later on. So starting out in terms of your actual beginning of your season, what are you going to see? Sunflowers are a little bit different in the way that they actually emerge from the ground, in that they don't actually push their cotyledons up through the soil, they'll actually drag them. So it's a bit of a shepherd's hook kind of look, so they'll actually emerge, pulling their cotyledons out of the ground surface, and once they appear they'll still have the seed coat on the actual cotyledons. So you'll see that either if it's a blue coloured or silver coloured, whatever the seed treatment colour is on the outside of the seed coat, it's still on there until they'll actually pop that seed coat off. Now that stage could take anywhere between 5 to 10 days depending on your soil temperatures and also the moisture. As a general rule of thumb, we recommend planting on 10 to 12 degrees soil temperatures and rising. Now usually that's taken at 8 AM Eastern Standard Time, and if you're, I suppose, keen to try and track those temperatures, the Met Bureaus have several sites across New South Wales and across Australia where you can actually look at your local soil temperatures. Okay, so if we move on to the actual growth stages themselves, with the American system, there's basically two letters to remember. The first one is V for vegetative, and the second one is R for reproductive. Now the vegetative growth stages are very easily defined in terms of just counting the number of leaves. So if you're at growth stage V2, you've got 2 leaves. If you're at V10, you've got 10 leaves. In terms of sunflowers actually growing, initially their leaves will appear in pairs. So you'll be basically at the stage where they have 2, 4 or 6 leaves. After that point in time, you'll start to see they'll differentiate, and the leaves will appear as alternate up the stem, and that will go on until you get to bud initiation. In terms of the total number of leaves that you can expect on a plant, it's varied depending on the hybrid, on your sowing time, so whether it's a spring plant or a main plant, and also your environmental conditions. Generally it's between 20 to 40, but I tend to see plants closer to the 20 than I do the actual 40 leaf number. Overall, leaf formation is going to be influenced by a lot of environmental factors, and we'll talk about some of those a bit later on. Sunflowers actually produce a lot of leaf dry matter, and the actual accumulation of leaf dry matter is quite rapid throughout the season. But basically, if you're looking for some rules of thumb about how important those leaves are, largely as each leaf unfolds, they'll start to increase their photosynthetic capacity. So by 10 to 14 days after they've emerged, they'll be at the peak time for photosynthetic capacity. After that, their actual value will start to decline as the leaf senesces and the next leaf comes into place. In total, the leaf area you can look at is anywhere between 2 and 6,000 square centimetres. So there's a lot of leaf area to be supported there. And most of your leaf area is pretty much in place by the time you get to flowering, but you will still see a bit more leaf area coming out. And that's not in terms of new leaves being produced, but it's leaves that are actually underneath the bud when it starts to develop that will just continue to unfold and grow in size. Just get back there. So one other point I just wanted to make in terms of leaves is which leaves should you be looking to protect in the situation where you, for example, end up with some powdery mildew in there. It's always about which leaves are contributing the most to your yield. With sunflowers, it's usually the mid to top 1/3 of your leaves that are the most important drivers of yield. Now that's for several reasons. Obviously those leaves are closer to the top of the plant, so they're the ones that have greater access to sunlight. And obviously the leaves down the bottom of the plant will continue to get more shaded as the season goes on. But largely it's those leaves who are going to be the biggest drivers of pulling back all the nutrients towards developing seeds. Sunflowers have a few, I suppose, unusual traits that we like to talk about. The first one is in terms of their stomates. So sunflowers are not actually able to close their stomates, which is why you'll see them wilt quite readily in the middle of the day. Now, the factor with stomates is probably most widely studied over in France, where in fact they've looked at some studies saying, well, if we could actually change a hybrid genetically, so breed a hybrid that would close its stomates, we think our yield potential would be so much higher, that actually not being able to close the stomates is one of the most critical factors in affecting yield. That's because obviously those plants are continuing to lose water all through the day. As a key indicator, particularly for anyone who has the option of irrigating, we'll talk about wilting a bit later on in terms of an indicator of when you should irrigate. It's fine for those plants to wilt in the middle of the day, and also you would expect that their leaf temperature will actually increase. So as the leaves are struggling to actually transpire enough water, the temperature will go up and you'll be able to feel that. But at night the plants should recover. If they don't, then it's a sign that the plants are getting water stressed. Okay, so onto the stems. Stems in sunflowers can be hugely varied in terms of their overall length or height. The shortest crops I've probably seen have been around that 50 centimetres, and the tallest have been, upwards and above of 2.2 metres. So there's a huge variation there. The tendency is for the spring plant sunflowers to be taller. That's because they're generally developing under cooler conditions. So they've got a longer period of time from planting until flowering. Overall, as a general rule of thumb, the taller crops are the higher yielding. And that is obviously an important disclaimer to put in there, is provided they don't run out of anything when they get to those key growth stages. So there's no point producing a massive biomass crop, exceptionally tall, if you haven't got the water to actually finish it. If we look at the other side then of the plant, so we look at the root system, as a general rule of thumb, plants are actually extending their root systems to the same length as those plants are in terms of height. So if your plants are 1.8 metres tall, then they're usually extracting down to 1.8 metres in the profile. So that's a lot of water that those plants are actually able to access. Initially, the root development is a little bit faster than the stem, so the plants are actually developing their root systems to support the plant later on. But they are a taprooted plant. So in terms of row spacing, we'll talk a bit about their access to water further into the row. But please remember they are a taprooted plant, so they are not like sorghum. They won't actually pull way out into the middle of a double skip. So if we move on now to the R stages, so these are all the reproductive stages. The first and most important R stage is R1, and this is what we call the star kind of stage, and it's also really the point where you start to see this little star appearance in the centre, which is going to be your developing bud. So at this point you've got the total number of leaves that you're going to have on the plant, and they're all basically stacked just around and underneath this initial bud here, and so those leaves will just continue to unfold. The next stage is R2, and that's when you can actually see a bud in terms of, if you wanted to actually measure it in terms of diameter across the top, you could do that. So with R2, this is where you start to actually get into all the important stages of, we're looking at differentiation for total floret number, potentially total seed number, and obviously it's a fairly critical stage in terms of avoiding stress. Okay, the next stage is R3. This is just a continuation pretty much of R2, where the actual bud itself is just getting larger. Now often I tend to measure the actual bud size in trial work just to give me an indicator of how close we're getting to flowering. And usually the total bud size will get to kind of between 8 and 12 centimetres in actual diameter, just before you start to see the ray petals emerge. The ray petals, which are that first initial yellow that you'll see, and I suppose the pretty part of the crop around here, are at R4. At this stage you'll just start to see a touch of yellow appearing in the crop. At this stage, now when we've got buds, you'll start to see the plants will respond also to sunlight. So people are probably familiar with the conversation about sunflowers following the sun. And apart from being a kind of cute anecdotal trait, there is an important factor to that as well. So sunflowers, it's called heliotropism, and they actually use this trait to pretty much increase their access to sunlight. So the plants will actually lift their leaves and move their heads to follow the sun during the day to try and continue to capture additional sunlight. In total, it's basically an increase of about 9% in terms of photosynthesis from that practice. At the end of the season, they'll pretty much return to face east, and I think Kevin's got a great demonstration later on about harvesting and the impacts with that. So let's get down to, I suppose, the more important end of the season in terms of yield and looking at the head itself. Sunflowers are called a compound head, and that means that they've got two different types of flowers. The first type of flower is these outside ray petals, which are actually there in 2 rows, and there could be between 30 and 70 of those. Now, in the days when we had open pollinated hybrids, they were obviously a fairly attractive source to bees, so it was important for those ray petals to be there for actually attracting insects to the crop to be pollinated. These days, because our hybrids are largely self-compatible, it's really about, well, just don't they look pretty? Okay. But they also provide some useful indicators in terms of the actual growth stages themselves. The more important flowers are these actual disc florets, which form across the head here. And each one of those individual flowers has the potential to produce a seed. So obviously we want to try and increase the number of those that we end up with at the end of the season. So now we're getting to the stage where the head is fully open. So this is R5. So this is the only stage where it actually is subdivided into different categories. So through R5, we basically separate the stages of flowering across the head by a decimal system. So sunflowers will start to flower from the outside of the head, so from the outside rings, as you might say, and move progressively into the centre of the head. So on the left here, we would call that R5.3, so about a third of the way in, and R5.8 here as we're getting closer to that centre. The maximum number of potential florets that you can have in a head is up to 3,000. Now, seed number is a massive driver of yield in all crops, and so we want to try and maximise the number of seeds that we're actually producing in each head. So we want to try and focus on getting as many seeds fertilised and then through to producing a viable kernel at the end of the season. In terms of the pollen in that head, sunflower pollen is quite large and very heavy. So it's not readily transported by wind, it's more transported by insects. Now, as I said, hybrids are largely self-compatible these days, but you will still see a number of bees foraging in those crops and actually, looking around to access the pollen. And that's just an additional benefit. So we always try and consider them when we're spraying because we want to see as many seeds fertilised as possible. If an actual disc floret is not fertilised, what can happen is that the actual hull, so the outside of the seed, may still develop. And we often say this is a trap for young players. When you see the crop developing and it looks like it's setting a lot of seed, and you might be looking at the heads, and going, well, everything looks like it's moving along very nicely here. The important part is to actually remove some of those individual seeds and squeeze them and see whether or not there's a kernel developing inside. Because there is a potential for seeds to not be fertilised and just basically fill a hull but no kernel, and that could be affected by a number of things such as rain at flowering or sunburn or a range of other factors. So it's important to always check that. Okay. The next stage is R6. This is the point in time when you know that flowering is finished because those ray petals will actually wilt and start to fall off. Unfortunately, I tend to say that this is also the stage when sunflowers go from being a very pretty crop to something that's going to be pretty ugly in a couple of weeks. But it's a very important stage for us as we're starting to look for those indicators for physiological maturity. So we know now that we're into those key points of filling seed and moving towards the end of the season. Hybrids are variable in some ways in terms of their head type. Most of the variation is in terms of how they actually carry their heads, so whether they're more upright or whether they're quite pendulous. The move in terms of breeding has been towards hybrids with some level of pendulous head type, and that's to get away from sunburn. So heads that will face more upright and hold directly towards the sun have the risk of being burnt, particularly along the top of the head, which will mean empty hulls and no kernels. As those heads start to develop though, and we end up with not just a hull but also a kernel in the centre, the weight of that seed developing will start to pull the heads further down, and so they'll face further down towards the ground as the heads fill. In terms of seed fill, we try and break it into a couple of different stages. So firstly, as I said, there's the outside hull, and that starts to develop pretty much as soon as flowering has commenced, and it will finish by about 14 days after enthesis, which is 14 days after flowering. So you can see that hull development is finished early on. After that, it's the kernel development that we're looking at. It's not just the size of the kernel, but then if it's an oil sunflower, so if you're producing mono or polyunsaturated sunflowers, then it's the oil lay down during that period that's very important. Now, the actual kernel development doesn't start until 8 days after enthesis. So you can see it's the next stage, and oil will be the last thing to be laid down in terms of forming that kernel. In terms of some of the characteristics of that kernel, the higher the oil content of a seed, generally speaking, the harder it is to dehull. So the actual kernel itself tends to stick more to the outside hull. And that's important for the confectionery guys because they want basically a seed that's easy to split the kernel from the outside hull. So typically what you'll find is that the confectionery hybrids that are purely for that market, so things like Galar or Sunbird 7, have lower oil contents. And that's because we don't need their oil, they're not bred for that. Now the one distinction in that market is Aussie Gold 4, which is a dual purpose. So it's both a polyunsaturated and also suitable for dehulling. So it is one hybrid that's actually different in that market. Okay, physiological maturity. This is probably the stage that I get the most phone calls about from growers and advisors. How do we actually pick the point when that crop has finished seed fill? This is called R9. So the 3 stages that will go on here is pretty much R7, which is when everything's still green. The back of the head's green, the bracts around the outside of the head are green, and we're still filling seed. The next point will be R8, where you'll see the back of the actual head start to change colour and go a bit yellow. The important factor here in determining physiological maturity is the outside of this head here, these kind of, I suppose, fake leaves that are attached to the back of the head, which are called the bracts. Once they turn brown, that's physiological maturity. That means your crop has finished seed fill, and all that has to occur after this point is dry down. So if you were going to think about a desiccation, then that is the growth stage you need to identify. And at that point, you're at pretty close to 35% seed moisture. In terms of these growth stages, and particularly physiological maturity, it's, I suppose, a useful indicator to have many of these kind of visual signs that you can refer to. It's also important to think about how the head is filled. in terms of a sunflower head, because it starts flowering on the outside rings of the head, they're going to be the largest seeds. They're the ones that get first access to everything. So it's typical to expect that the seeds in the centre of the head are always going to be smaller. But we would always like to see the head evenly filled right to the centre. If the head's not filled to the centre, it's usually a sign that you've either had some stress at bud initiation, which has meant that the plant has responded by saying, you know, I can't fill enough seeds here, there's not going to be enough water, I'm just not even going to go there. I'm just going to cut back total seed number now and try and save the resources. Otherwise, it could be a response to some other stress like frost at flowering or cold temperatures or other things that would give you an indicator of a lower yield. In the manuals, I've included as much information that we've got available in terms of the actual days to different growth stages. First up, you'll find that there's a fairly generic table like this, which just gives you a walkthrough between early and a late planting, so saying, you know, an early October versus a late December. Probably the key thing you would start to see here is that the difference in the number of days from beginning of your plant to flowering is quite different depending on an early and a late plant. At Gunnedah, we tend to expect that on a spring plant, most of our hybrids won't reach flowering until about 80 to 85 days after planting. If you plant the same hybrid in December, it'll get to flowering in 60 to 65 days. So that's how much the actual plant will quicken up in response to those increased day temperatures. The other information I've included is a bit more specific relating to each hybrid. So where possible, when Steph and I had access to hybrids, we've tried to basically plant some trials and follow them through to give you an indication of how quick some of those hybrids will move through the different stages. Now, some hybrids actually will respond to a change in planting time more than others. So some hybrids will get quicker, substantially quicker on the late plant than they are in comparison to the other hybrids on the early plant. There's a bit of information in there as well. Now, in terms of sunflowers, we're trying to get more detailed information as we go along. And sadly, in many cases, there hasn't been a lot of research work done since the late 70s or early 80s. But I've basically collected as much as is relevant at the moment. And so this is the kind of stage that we're trying to move to now, is actually giving some more specific growth degree days. Some of this data is from overseas, but we've tried to use what we think is applicable here. Okay, so now we've walked through all the actual visual stages of sunflower growth and development, and so we want to look at what are some of the other drivers of growth and development in terms of environmental. Drop the mic. Going to be in trouble with Brian? Maybe. Sorry, Brian. Can I go without it?
Yeah, just hang on, just hold it.
So sad. Oh no. I think I'll do my own modifications. Just one moment. Maybe? Maybe not. I think I'd have this down pat now with all the great media appearances about how much the rain means to people. Okay, so the next aspect is part 3. So what are the key drivers of growth and development? First one is genetics. So we've talked a bit about the different hybrids, and we'll talk more about the hybrids later in agronomy. Second one is in terms of environmental. So we're looking at moisture and temperature and day length. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, day length has a bit of an impact, more so on some hybrids than others. But your planting time is probably going to have the largest impact. So whether you're planting into the spring or planting later into the summer. Temperature is a very important factor for sunflowers. Sunflowers are quite happy to grow in very warm conditions. So in that 25 to 28 degrees is optimum, but they can grow quite happily above the 30 degrees. The issue comes when you start to have temperatures above 35 degrees, and in particular consistent temperatures above 35 degrees. Sunflower heads, in terms of their temperature, are warmer than what is the ambient temperature outside. So if it's 35 degrees as an ambient temperature, the actual temperature inside the head is 5 degrees warmer. So you need to kind of keep that in mind, I suppose, in terms of your actual sowing time and trying to avoid those really hot periods when you know it's likely to be exceptionally above 35 or as hot as possible. If you're going to work back to growth degree days, then the base temperature is about 7 degrees for sunflowers. Now, sunflowers have a very, I suppose, different response in terms of their end use to temperature. So if you're going to be planting mono-unsaturated sunflowers, they're typically planted mostly on the spring plant. The reason for that is that sunflowers, which are monos, you're trying to produce high levels of oleic acid. Now, the oleic acid levels are increased when the seed is filling under warm temperatures. So that's typically why most of the buyers will only offer contracts for mono-unsaturated on the early plant. So they won't generally offer a contract for a polyunsaturated on that early plant because you want polyunsaturated sunflowers to be filling in the cooler temperatures. So it's the converse kind of relationship. So this probably explains it better than I do with one picture. As the actual temperature here increases, you can see that this solid line, which is linoleic acid, which is what your polyunsaturated sunflowers are producing, so we are trying to get that 62% level with linoleic, it declines as your temperatures get warmer. The oleic acid, so the mono sunnies, it increases as the temperatures get warmer. Okay, so moisture. Obviously, water is always a very important driver of most stages of development of the crop. If you're trying to avoid moisture stress with sunflower plants, the key stages are those reproductive stages. So it's from budding through to seed film. Now, sunflowers will kind of moderate their own growth in response to moisture conditions, not only by wilting to try to conserve some of their water, but also by producing smaller leaves if they think that it is going to be a bit of a hard, dry season. This is just a quick photo about what we're trying to avoid. And this is one of the things you'll see when things go really badly, which is in terms of poor seed set. And Sue Thompson will actually cover a lot more on this later on and has some really good photos. The other driver of growth and development is nutrition. Now I'm just going to touch on it here because we're going to spend more time talking about it later. But with sunflowers, nitrogen is the most important factor, like with most crops, and it's probably the biggest driver of nearly everything in sunflower growth. So it has an impact on obviously your yield and oil content, but it also has an impact on the size of leaves, number of leaves, and a range of other factors. Bit of acadacca to start the morning. Okay, so let's look at frost then. So frost is important to avoid for two reasons. We want to avoid it at the start of the season. So we basically want to work on our sowing times so that we get the crop out of the ground under good soil temperatures and know that by the time that crop actually gets to the 6th leaf stage, that we'll be out of the period of frost. Okay? Because they're quite tolerant up until then, but after that point they're quite sensitive. They're also quite sensitive at the other end of the season, so during the flowering and seed fill stages. If your crop does get frosted, it's very visual. So you'll see the symptoms very soon after the frost event occurs, and that'll be in terms of blackening of the leaf margins. If it's at the stage where you've got buds, you'll see the buds going black around the outside. And obviously, as things progress, if you've had a severe frost, then you start to see poor seed set occurring. Okay, so we're starting to get on to some of the more depressing factors here. What happens if your crop gets hailed on? Okay, in the unlikely event that your sunflowers get hailed on. I say unlikely because it happens and we all know it. But what will you actually, I suppose, expect as a result from your crop getting hailed on? The first thing will be, the most obvious, is going to be damage to those leaves. Now with sunflowers, unless you're actually losing more than about 33% of your actual total leaf area, you shouldn't expect to see any effects. Okay? If you end up with hail damage to the stems, it will usually just be purely in terms of marking because the stems themselves are quite solid. Head injury is probably the other damaging stage for hail. Not only in terms of the heads getting a bit knocked around with hail, but also in terms of it actually making holes in the back of the head, which are then leaving it open to infection with things like rhizopus. And although Sue's not here yet, I don't want to steal her thunder because she gets really, really cranky with me taking all of her good points. So there is some really good data about the effects of leaf loss from the states, and I've included that in the manual so that you can refer to that later on. This past season, we've tended to use this data as the most important thing for giving people advice about leaf loss due to loopers. And that's because there's not a lot of other data out there. Okay, so let's go to the other side of the equation, looking at drought. So we run out of water. As I said, sunflowers have a quite high total leaf area, so there's a lot of biomass there to support. In extreme drought, the plant will respond itself depending on the stage of growth when the drought period hits. So if the crop is droughted from early on, it'll reduce all of its growth characteristics. So the crop will be shorter, the leaves will be smaller, and it'll have that time to actually adjust by dropping off seed number and other things. If the drought occurs later in the season, when that plant is already set up with a large biomass, then yield is going to be the biggest factor that's going to be affected because the plant doesn't have as much room to actually compensate by reducing the other growth. I might just go back to heat stress and temperature. And the reason for going back here is just to actually make you aware of some fairly great work from actually Argentina. And I tend to say that I've become a little bit of a groupie in terms of following this lady's research. So Deborah Rondinini, who's been based in Argentina, has been doing a lot of work looking at what effects those high night temperatures have on seed fill and oil content. And so from her work, she's basically been showing that, that final grain weight can be reduced by up to 55% by peak temperatures greater than that 35 degrees in that critical stage 12 to 18 days after flowering. So there's some fairly major impacts there. It's also shown big impacts on total weight in terms of seed weight being reduced by up to 40% in those critical stages as well. I think the key factor here of this slide is probably just to look at, apart from reiterating some of the things I've said earlier about sunburn and checking those seeds that are being filled, but also is to look at the temperatures and then monitor your crop for what's actually happening with seed fill. The last point I've got there is waterlogging, and I'll talk about that a lot more in the agronomy section because we'll cover a bit on irrigation and overall waterlogging or critical stages to water. It's also my favourite slide because I know that this one comes afterwards, which means that I'm finished. And what we're going to move on to now is, I suppose, just a couple of quick questions to actually try and, well, wake up anyone who's dozed off during the earlier parts of the talk, and also to try and recap on a few things that we've discussed. So for those of you who are going to fill in the accreditation, this is the time when we'll pull those out and just have a walk through those questions so you can fill them in as we're going, and we'll be done in 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, so in the accreditation, you should have a range of questions. First ones are the ones where you're actually required to write something. The last 3 or 4 are the ones that we love the most, where you just have to circle something and you've got a 25% chance of being right. So, first question is, outline the impact that temperature has on oil content and quality of monounsaturated sunflowers. So this is a bit of a refresher to, well, what happens when we have warm temperatures during seed fill with monounsaturated sunnies? Say that again, Joe? More oleic acid, yep. Yep. Okay, anyone else want to have a stab in the dark? There should be no fear here. It's all okay. And so for assistance, we put the answers in just for anyone who wants a little bit of help. So monounsaturated sunnies are more suited to those warmer temperatures, and just like Joe said, they prefer to be filling their seed under warmer temps to actually get that higher oleic acid levels. Obviously the outstanding kind of event there that could occur is excessive heat stress, which means that your seed fill is going to be affected. Okay. Second question I put in there is about the critical period during which heat stress will affect final grain weight. So this is some of my, my groupie activity, where I said that I was very attached to Deborah Rondinini's work. So I'm referring to that last couple of slides there where she was saying, well, what actually is going to be the critical period there? Does anyone remember? Spot on. 12 to 18 days after flowering. And she'd showed a reduction there by up to 55%.
How long is that peak temperature duration required to do that? Like a one-day event, is that going to be significant, or are we talking for that whole 12 to 18?
It's a bit of a function of how long it goes on for. So the longer it goes on for, obviously the greater the effect. Yeah. With her work, she was doing alternating day and night temperatures over about a 7 to 10 day period. And showing that that's the worst kind of possible scenario. But yeah, it's really going to depend on how long you have that kind of extreme temperature.
So was there a diurnal relationship there too, like day and night temperature?
Yes.
Like
Yep. Yep. So with her work, she was doing alternating day and night temperatures, and you know, generally if it's cooler at night, that tends to actually help the plant actually recover. And so there was less of an effect with that when the night temperatures were a little bit cooler, but yeah, it is a factor of, you know, the consistency of those temperatures and how long it goes on for. Second part was how much is it possible for seed weight to be reduced? So seed weight, what was the maximum percentage? Oh, no, that was the one above. I was going to say, I think Josh is actually, what did you say? 40%, yep. So you're on the first one, Joe, and Josh had the second line. So that's that seed weight.
Does that mean that test weight? Talking about that?
Yes, yep. And I mean, normally that's something we don't have an issue with here. Like the receivable standard's 32, but it can happen. But yeah, it's not something we typically.
What's a bit of that red or black the last year? Is that, you think that was before the last year or not?
No, last year I think we probably had more issues with poor pollination and actually a number of hulls being formed that weren't actually filled. Yep, yep. So, and Kevin talks a bit more in harvesting about some of the splits there in terms of actually getting less of those empty seeds through your sample. Okay, number 3, give an example of how sunflowers can limit their water use. Any thoughts? Reduce leaf size. What else do they do in the middle of the day? Wilt. Yep. And part A twice. I've obviously gotten very excited there. So it should be B, obviously. One feature of a sunflower plant which increases their water use. So what do they actually? Stomata stays open. Yep. They have a large leaf area, and they also have a large root system. So they do actually have the ability to explore a lot of soil water. I think that ends the hard part of the questions. So now we're down to this 1 in 4 chance of being right. So these questions, pretty much all of them relate to the pictures on the screen. So number 4, what plant growth stage is this? R1, spot on. So it's actually, we can see that there's this star-like appearance, bud initiation. And so that's called R1 or terminal bud formation. Question 5. What stage of flowering is this? See? Joe's actually spot on. You can get gold stars up the front there, Joe. So it's 5.5. It's probably, as I say, a little bit difficult to see with this light. But because these rings here are nearly halfway in towards the head. So that's the actual front of disc florets moving in. Okay. How do you determine physiological maturity? A. The bracts around the outside of the head are brown, correct? And I'm not sure, there should be a little A that pops in there, but there's not. Okay. This is always my favourite question. If you plant polyunsaturated sunflowers in the spring, so that they're actually filling their seed under warm temperatures, what could happen to oil quality? Linoleic acid could be above the 62%. It could fall below the 62% required level. The oil will turn green, or all of the birds around the area will lose their feathers. Yep. Quite correct, it is B. Linoleic acid levels will fall below 62%. And probably I lied earlier, because that actually is my favourite slide, I think.